All right, so the second half of Barbenheimer Phenomena, still in cinemas right now, is Oppenheimer, and Jim is going to talk about this film as well.
So Oppenheimer is the latest film from Christopher Nolan of, the Dark Knight trilogy fame, primarily Inception. Most recent film was Tenet, which was one of the very few films to be going out in cinemas in the autumn of 2020. And as the title might imply, it's a biopic of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the lead physicist behind the Los Alamos laboratory and the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb. And it kind of balances different stretches in his life. We see a little bit of him as a student. We see the lead up to the war with him teaching in university and kind of, having left-wing association, shall we say, and kind of flirting with members of the Communist Party, in particular, young woman Jean Tatlock, played by Florence Pugh. Oppenheimer is played by Cillian Murphy, who's been in a lot of Nolan's films, but mostly supporting roles. This is the first lead one he's had with him. And then, obviously, the development of the bomb and the collaborative effort between kind of like some, very prominent physicists of the day. And then it also kind of deals with the aftermath of it, the immediate aftermath, and then several years after, during the development of the hydrogen bomb and kind of the start of the Cold War. And in those segments, you get a little bit more from Louis Strauss. Like the name is spelled Strauss, but he points out it's a southern pronunciation. Louis Strauss, played by Robert Downey Jr. And the reason he comes into this is that there's basically a segment where he's going through his confirmation as a cabinet secretary in the US government, and he's been questioned about his role in the Oppenheimer affair. So basically, it cross-cuts a lot between these different timelines and brings them together, and stuff comes to light, and it finds ways to kind of like find, similarities in these timelines of tone and all the rest of it, and cuts across them. So it's a little bit kind of Christopher Nolan-y in the sense that, it's not just a straight linear biopic. We don't just go through from point A to B to C through the guy's life. We go between the two of them. But basically, it does that. The centerpiece of this is probably the Trinity test, right? There's the detonation of the atomic bomb after they developed it, but as it goes back and forth. But basically, that's what it is. It's a chronicle of the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer, using these different periods in his life, with a little bit of the aftermath dealt with through this segment of Louis Strauss, played by Robert Downey Jr. So I'm interested. So I'm a big Christopher Nolan fan. I have been very up and down with his films, though, right? I think the films of his that I really like. There have been a couple, and I'm kind of primarily thinking of his last film, Tenet, which I think they're really not good. I thought Tenet was a dreadful film, frankly, although I seem to be in a vocal minority about that. What did the pair of you think about this one?
So I'm kind of the same as you. I'm a little bit mixed on the films of Christopher Nolan, and I think when I also didn't like Tenet, and I think going on to what I like, or the films of his that I like the most, are when he's like reined in by, like, his script is reined in by either history or some source material. So like I really like his Batman films, and obviously they're reined in by the comic books that they're based on. I really loved Dunkirk that he did. And then I really enjoyed this one. It's one of my, I'd say it's one of my favorite Nolan films. And it's big and it's bold and it's intricate the way that he tells his story, but it's never so crazy that it becomes confusing or far-fetched in the way that some of his kind of more sciencey films, like mind-bending films, do. I really enjoyed this. I think there's so much going on in it, and there's so many people in it. It's got such a huge cast, and every 20 minutes there's Florence Pugh, there's Casey Affleck, Gary Oldman turns up for a scene. So it's got a phenomenal cast. I thought Cillian Murphy was terrific. I'm a huge fan of his anyway, from his work on Peaky Blinders and his other film work that he's done over the years. But like you say, this is definitely by far his biggest film role. Yeah, I think I would say it's kind of less. I think going into a film about the birth of the atomic bomb, the film itself is a little bit less explosive than you might think. It's a lot of just men talking in rooms, followed by men talking in rooms, followed by men talking in rooms. But I think for a film about that, it's a very, very good one. I wasn't so up on the history of the ins and outs of that time, politically or to do with Oppenheimer. So I found it fascinating. It's kind of like a Christopher Nolan history lesson, but a really enjoyable one. What did you think about it?
That's a good, I like that Christopher Nolan history lesson, and that's exactly what it was for me. I am very lukewarm on Christopher Nolan. I didn't see Tenet because it didn't sound good. Maybe it was Jim, you sort of saying you didn't like it through the whole process. But Memento, for me, when I first saw that film, I thought it was like, that was a Seinfeld episode that he took. And I'm not, I think, everyone finds him, he's one of these characters where I love that he exists in his, absolute, must shoot on film, must shoot this, exactly, must shoot it 70 mil or IMAX or all this stuff. So the fact that he has that sort of audacity and capacity to do this and take these stories and do them in these incredible ways that use film, I applaud that he exists out there, and I'm happy that he's part of the ecosystem. But I don't really respond to his films like they're the best thing I've ever seen. It's like the little PTA like discussions I have with cinephiles over the years. This one was pretty good. I think sometimes if you didn't know the story, I learned a lot about Oppenheimer. I learned a lot more after watching it. I probably need to go back and watch the film again, to like deal with the idiosyncrasies of what was happening. I thought the performances were incredible across the whole board. I thought they were really good. Robert Downey Jr., particularly Emily Blunt, I really liked as well. Cillian Murphy, of course. Like the film was really, really good. I think sometimes, as you said, a bunch of people talking, I maybe expected, because this whole idea about the explosion and how it was filmed and all this stuff was very, very spectacular. All the effort that was put in it, that the story would have been a little bit less about being in someone's head all the time, like his own existential crisis. And for 3 hours or however long we're talking, that was a lot of non-explosive activity happening. But that being said, it's a really incredible period of history. It's really important. And I think it was handled well. But I maybe agree with you, Garry, that this is one of his better ones.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that, right? So I think generally speaking, I have liked Christopher Nolan's films, right? I would say the only ones that I've really had a strong negative reaction to are Interstellar and Tenet, right? And the reason I bring up Interstellar is because that's probably the other film where he gets the heavy, or attempts to get the heaviest into kind of like scientific stuff, right? And obviously, like, there's bits of Interstellar a bit more fantastical, and I think Gary's point about his best work being when he's reined in by something, right? Whether it's history or source material or something like that. I think there's something to that, right? Now, for me, unlike Amanda, I really like Memento, for instance. And like Inception doesn't necessarily fall into that category, but I think about Interstellar and what it did with like scientific stuff, and I personally think it used it to give it an air of gravitas, and it was a load of old hooey, right? That's me, and I think there's scenes in there which reveal the fact that its understanding is quite shallow, right? And I'm going to burnish my own credentials here, right? My background is chemical engineering. I've studied chemistry and physics quite a lot, right? I'm not J. Robert Oppenheimer, but when something rubs me up the wrong way on these things, it really gets my goat, right? And Interstellar did that. This film did not, and I think the reason for that is, there's plenty in here for kind of like physics and history nerds, if you like. but I think it's centered a lot of it, understandably, given the title of the film, on Cillian Murphy's performance as Oppenheimer, and I think that's crucial here. And I think the other thing is the management of time here. I think what's interesting, when people go on about Christopher Nolan's management of time, right? The go-to things in these examples are probably going to end up being Tenet, right? Which I think it used as a crutch for a film that was a load of old shite myself. But whatever. This is not a review of Tenet or Memento, right? And Memento has its structure, and you either like it, you don't appreciate it, like that. That's fine. But I think his use of this, like manipulating timelines in the film, is matured, and I think he's doing it a lot better now, Tenet notwithstanding. And I'm glad that you both brought up Dunkirk as an example of this, because I personally think, there's probably films that I like more of his, or maybe more of a favorite. Like I probably rewatched The Dark Knight more times, and this sort of thing. And I have a lot of fun with The Prestige and things like that. But I think Dunkirk is his technically most accomplished film, right? I think that is his best made film. I don't think this is far behind. And I think in both films, it's the management of time that really gives it its sense of momentum and what it's building towards. And in the case of Oppenheimer, it's interesting that so little of it actually factors on the explosion, right? And I think that, to Amanda's point, right, there was a lot of marketing stuff like, oh, he didn't use CGI, he's filmed it practically, blah, blah, blah. But I think what's quite actually good about the use of the explosion is because it's cutting between these different timelines quite a lot, it lends that same sense of urgency and import to these other things, right? So to talk to the point about kind of like a load of men sitting around talking rooms, it is, right? But if this was to be dealt with in a kind of like classically linear way, the way you might do with a kind of like more traditional dull biopic, right? Some of these scenes would be as boring as shit, frankly. I mean, like, let's not beat around the bush here. They would be. But because they're going back and forth between kind of like this rush to develop it, the explosion, the aftermath, and it does reveal stuff as it goes along, particularly about Robert Downey Jr.'s character, Louis Strauss, who's not a man I knew anything about before this film. It does lend that same sense of momentum, urgency, and import to all of these events. And I think that comes together when you get to the end of it, right? Because at the end of the film, right, and this isn't much of a spoiler, it's probably fairly obvious, the end of the film is not chronologically the last point in what we see depicted in the film, right? And I think it's the idea that this is all one whole thing, and you need to look at it as an important series of events together. I think it really does that superbly. I think it's a superbly made film in that regard, and I think in that sense it's interesting that it's the same editor. It's the same, well, obviously it's the same director and Chris Nolan, but it's the same editor that he had for Tenet, because for Tenet it really didn't work for me, but this one, it really, really works superbly in my view. It's not a perfect film, right? And I'm not going to go too much into kind of like some of my minor issues with it. Like, I think one of the issues that I have with Christopher Nolan's scripts, right, I think he puts films together technically very well. They're not always, they have their clunky moments, and I think Alden Ehrenreich plays like an advisor to Robert Downey Jr.'s character, and I think he's firing out softball questions that allow the plot to get laid out, and I think it works for what the film needs it to do. But it's, I think in a lot of the Nolan fanboyism, some of these things kind of get glossed over. It's not, it's not the best in that sense. I think there's also a little bit too much gazing at kind of the stars of physics. Like Kenneth Branagh shows up and this is Niels Bohr, right? And I'm in a position where I know who Niels Bohr is, right? But you don't know who Niels Bohr is, right? Which, frankly, I don't know why. Like, anybody who hasn't studied physics, I don't know why you would know who Niels Bohr is. Like, you'd be thinking, like, why are we so excited about this dude played by Kenneth Branagh? Like, what's the deal? Like, because he's in it for all of about 2 scenes, but he's built up massively. And I think unless you kind of, have him as some part of it or go into it, it's, and then Heisenberg shows up as a ancillary character, and I don't mean to be uncharitable, but I think if you say the word Heisenberg, most people probably think of Breaking Bad these days rather than the actual physicist. There's little bits like that where I've criticized other films for, this not meaning anything to you unless you have that background. Otherwise, it's completely pointless within the film. This does have a couple of moments like that. I think the thing is, it has such momentum and relentlessness that it doesn't really matter. It kind of moves on swiftly from it. But I think, if you're looking at this film as a whole, I think you'd be remiss not to. I think I'd be remiss not to mention the fact that it's not a perfect film, but I think it's constructed so well that its flaws kind of are very quickly moved on from. And I think it focuses mainly on that central performance, and that central performance from Cillian Murphy is superb.
I think I agree with you a lot on that. That it's technically really like well put together. Also, I think that the geekiness around the details of all the people you've mentioned is in one part why it's hard to completely understand, because I felt that way where I was like, who are all these people in the room, and unless I knew more about it, it became a bit confusing, and why I would want to watch it again. But on the other hand, I read it's one of the most historically accurate portrayals of this this story, and probably just like it's a very historically accurate biopic. And it would be somebody like Nolan who's very obsessed with making sure, and maybe because of Interstellar he needed to go do a lot more research in this case, and then maybe that's why it also takes so long here and there. But I also agree with you on the time frame, or moving back from the time. And it annoyed me less than even, like I said, with Asteroid City and Wes Anderson, where we jumped back and forth with the black and white and the color and stuff like that. In this case, I thought it worked well, and it kept me sort of understanding where we were in time. And I thought it was actually quite useful as a narrative structure. All of that is like great improvements for Christopher Nolan, and I would happily go see this again.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. As I say, I think this is a very mature film. Right, I think and it sounds a bit strange to be saying that about a guy who had presumably must be in his 50s now and has been making films for 30 odd years or whatever. But it feels like a very accomplished film, and it feels like something which has been put together in exactly the way it needed to be to give it the impact it required. Right, and does it have some of the slight inelegancies that Christopher Nolan's scripts have? Yeah, sure, of course it does. But I think it gets away with them, and I think they're very minor complaints in what is an otherwise extremely effective film.
Yeah, I would just to chip in on the way that he handles time in this film. Just to go back to like how in Dunkirk he did the whole splitting it by the land, air, and sea, and I think like you say, Jim, about like some of these scenes without that structure could be quite boring, but the way that he weaves them all together I found was fascinating, and it's so well constructed and accomplished. And I will just say that I also think it's not a perfect film, and it does have its flaws, and it's kind of got the flaws that have ran through Nolan's films for a while. And I will just say that, like, I think I don't want to take anything away from Emily Blunt and Florence Pugh's performances, but I just think that the way that the characters are written in a way to sort of become, I mean, obviously it's based on a true story, so they can't change the outcome, the fates of the characters, but like I just think that the way that it's presented, where they're both made victims to kind of further Oppenheimer's arc, I don't know whether they needed to be done in that way. I've seen the film with my wife, and she came out and said that she kind of felt like it was such a male-dominated film, like the whole men talking rooms thing, and she was saying, obviously, like, there's women in the film and there's women in his life, and it's a biopic of his life, so they have to be there. But she was like, the way that they treat the women in this film, it's almost like it would have been better. She said, like, there was this point in the film where he's being interrogated and somebody mentions that he's a womanizer, and I think they could have like that was enough to know that he was a womanizer without kind of showing some of this gratuitous stuff in there the way that they did. So I think in some ways he's improving as a filmmaker and the way that he tells his stories, but I think there's still room for improvement in the way that his female characters are written.
Yeah, I would agree with that a bit, except I did think Emily Blunt, as I mentioned, I thought her character was a little bit more complex, and I thought was interesting. And in fact, I would was very interesting to see her character and learn more about Kitty as a as a person from this film, where I thought Florence Pugh's character and the relationship that they were having was not very effective in the story. Like, I mean, obviously it's an important part of the story, Jean Tatlock, but I do think that it wasn't, I just didn't buy it like this, the romance as much. And I like Florence Pugh as an actor or whatnot, and obviously Cillian did a great job overall, but that was probably the least the least apt, least best part of the film for me, was that relationship, where I think on the other hand, Emily Blunt at least brought in a really unique, for that period of time, a really interesting sort of person with her own mind, and sort of so I thought that was quite interesting for me.
Yeah, I think Emily Blunt is she's really good in the role, but I think and she does get her moments towards the end where there is like a payoff to the kind of the long-suffering wife trope that it kind of employs a little bit. But I do think that how many of the men in those rooms would be I don't know, smoking themselves to death or drinking themselves to death, and like it was the 40s and the 50s. It was very much part of the culture then, and I don't know, it kind of grated a little bit that like the one alcohol problem that they show is of course like the one central woman in it, to kind of like level some kind of criticism at her character, where you see the bottle of whiskey falling out her bag, or you see like the scene where he gets home and she's alone, like drinking in the dark. It's kind of like at that time, I guess, like there would have been like all the characters would have had their vices, but it was just like the way that the film kind of zoned
I think there
that.
I mean, we were talking about length, but I think there was a lot missing, and I think you're right. I think maybe that skew on that side, to make that character look that way. Also, I think there was a lot missing in terms of the anti-Semitism that was going on within, like there wasn't much focus on that as well. Like you all both said, there's quite a lot of omissions because it's a complex story. But for something fairly accurate, it's not like Blonde, Marilyn Monroe's biopic, which we all loved, with a huge bit of sarcasm there.
Yeah, I think I think I'd agree with both of you to some extent on that, right? And I think in terms of Christopher Nolan as a filmmaker, like the fact that he can't write women, or he's poor at writing women, is something that comes up quite often. And I think it's actually sometimes a little bit harsh. I'm not sure it is here, to be honest. Like I think Emily Blunt brings more to that role than there maybe is in the script, right? Because she gets her kind of like triumphant moment towards the end, and I think the way that she inhabits that scene and kind of delivers it brings a lot more to it than necessarily would have been written on the page. I think Florence Pugh does quite well with her role. In particular, there's one scene where I think is not something I've seen in a Nolan film before, and I think it works quite well in terms of kind of like understanding the impact that relationship, or in particular the way that relationship ended, let's say, has on Oppenheimer, right? And I think from a filmmaking perspective, like let's say a directorial standpoint, it works very well. From a writing standpoint, I'm not sure the build up to that point really gets across the impact or the importance of that relationship in his life. And I think this leads me to my whole thing with Christopher Nolan, which is I think he's a fantastic director. I think he's a really good technical filmmaker, and even certain aspects of the storytelling in terms of like management timelines we've spoken about, I think he's excellent there. I don't think he's a great writer, right? And I think that comes through. Unfortunately for him, I think it comes through a little bit more in his female characters, but frankly, it shows up all over the place. I've already said about kind of like these ridiculous exposition scenes that are in everything. And I think the things that suffered the most from it were things like Tenet, was Interstellar. I think it was in The Dark Knight Rises as well, for instance, and things like that. I think when he's doing any of the writing, it's a lot less accomplished in my view. And I think that kind of all links back to Gary's original point about it's maybe even not so much he's reined in by source material, it's really guided, right? He's maybe a little bit more guided by them. But I think to circle back to your points about those female leads, and Emily Blunt, and probably more supporting in terms of Florence Pugh, but I think that's maybe where it shows up in terms of the character work in this film, which otherwise I think is pretty good, to be honest.
So overall, we all liked both films. If you had to pick your favorite of the bunch, I'm going for Barbie. What would you go for, Gary?
I'd go Barbie as well. Yeah.
And Jim?
I'll go Oppenheimer. I think we knew this, but give us a bit of variety.
We like variety here at Cinetopia. But yeah, so that's Barbenheimer reviewed, and it's still out in cinemas, and hopefully for a bit longer. Keep coming to the cinemas, and it's a great summer for cinema. We're on to the film festival next.